Chapter 1. Rosa's Quiet Life. My name is Rosa, and I live alone on a small farm. It's a quiet place, surrounded by fields and trees. Every morning, I wake up early to take care of my garden. I grow vegetables like tomatoes, potatoes, and carrots. I also have a few animals: a goat, some chickens, and an old dog named Bruno. They keep me company. But even with all the work on the farm, my mind always goes to my son, Marco. Oh, my Marco. He left many years ago to fight in a war far away. I remember the day he left like it was yesterday. He was so young, so brave. He hugged me tightly and said, "Mama, I'll come back." I promise every day since then, I've waited for him. I set a place for him at the table, just like I used to when he was a boy. I imagine him sitting there, eating the food I cooked, telling me stories about his day. But the chair stays empty, and the plate stays full. At night, I kneel by my bed and pray. I pray for his safety. I pray for his return. I look at the stars and whisper, "Please, bring my son back to me." Life on the farm is hard, but I keep going. I keep hoping. Because deep in my heart, I believe Marco will come home. I have to believe it. He's my son, and a mother's love never fades. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees, I feel a chill. I wonder where he is. Is he safe? Is he hungry? Is he thinking of me, just as I'm thinking of him? I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing. I will wait for Marco. No matter how long it takes, I will wait. Chapter 2. The War Begins. Let me take you back to a time when my Marco was still here with me. He was just a young man then, full of life and dreams. We lived together on this farm, working side by side. He was strong and kind, always helping me with the heavy work. But those peaceful days didn't last. One day, news came to our village. A war had started in a faraway land. People were afraid. They talked about danger and fighting. Marco listened quietly, but I could see something changing in his eyes. He was thinking deeply. One evening, after dinner, he sat me down. "Mama," he said, his voice steady but soft, "I've decided to join the army. I want to protect our country. I want to do my part." My heart sank. I didn't want him to go. I didn't want him to face the dangers of war. But I could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't just my little boy anymore. He was a man, ready to stand up for what he believed in. I hugged him tightly, tears streaming down my face. "Marco, my son, please be careful," I whispered. "Promise me you'll come back." He held my hands and looked into my eyes. "I promise, Mama, I'll come back to you. No matter what happens, I'll come home." The day he left was the hardest day of my life. I packed his bag with warm clothes and his favourite food. I walked with him to the edge of the village, where other young men were gathering. They all looked so brave, but also so young, too young for war. Before he left, Marco hugged me one last time. "Take care of the farm, Mama," he said with a smile. I'll be back before you know it. I watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the distance. My heart ached, but I was also proud. My son was brave. He was doing what he thought was right. From that day on, my life changed. The farm felt emptier without him. Every morning, I woke up wondering where he was. Every night, I prayed for his safety. I held on to his promise, his words echoing in my mind. I'll come back. But as the days turned into months, and the months into years, the war dragged on. I didn't hear from Marco. I didn't know if he was safe or hurt, or I couldn't let myself think the worst. I had to keep hoping. Chapter 3. Waiting and hoping. Those years after Marco left were long and heavy. Life on the farm went on, but it was not the same without him. Every morning, I woke up early, just as I always did. I fed the animals, tended to the garden, and worked the fields. The work was hard, but it kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering too far into worry. I wrote letters to Marco, so many letters. I told him about the farm, about how the tomatoes were growing, how Bruno the dog still waited by the gate for him. I asked him how he was, if he was eating enough, if he was safe. I sent those letters with hope, but no replies ever came. I didn't know if he received them, or if the war had taken him too far away. At night, when the work was done, I would sit outside and look at the stars. The sky was so big, so endless. I wondered if Marco was looking at the same stars, wherever he was. I whispered to the sky, "Please, keep him safe. Bring him back to me." The war didn't end quickly. It dragged on, year after year. I grew older, my hands rougher, my hair greyer, but my hope never faded. I held on to Marco's promise like a lifeline. "I'll come back," he had said. I believed him. I had to. Sometimes the neighbours would come by to check on me. They would bring food or help with the heavy work. "Rosa," they would say, "you're so strong. How do you keep going?" I would smile and say, "I have to. Marco is coming home." But there were nights when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear. I would sit by the fireplace, staring at the empty chair where Marco used to sit. I would imagine him walking through the door, his smile lighting up the room. I would imagine him saying, "Mama, I'm home." Those dreams kept me going. They gave me strength. But as the years passed, the war showed no signs of ending. The news from the front was always the same. More fighting, more loss. I tried not to think about the worst. I focused on the farm, on the animals, on the hope that one day my son would return. Chapter 4. The war ends. Let me tell you about the day the war ended. It was a day I had prayed for, dreamed of, for so many years. The news spread quickly through the village. People ran into the streets, laughing, crying, hugging each other. Bells rang and songs filled the air. The war was over, finally over. My heart leaped with joy. Marco will come home now, I thought. He promised. I ran to the gate, my eyes scanning the road, waiting for the moment I would see him walking toward me. I imagined his face, his smile, his voice calling out, "Mama, I'm back." But the hours passed and he didn't come. The days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of him. The village celebrated, but my heart grew heavier. Where was he? Why hadn't he returned? I asked everyone who might know. I went to the soldiers who came back, hoping for news. But no one had seen him. No one could tell me where he was. My hope began to waver, but I couldn't let it go. Not yet. Every night I set a place for him at the table, just as I had done all those years. I cooked his favourite meals, hoping he would walk through the door and sit down to eat. But the chair stayed empty, the food untouched. The neighbours tried to comfort me. "Rosa," they said gently, "maybe it's time to accept that he's not coming back." But I shook my head. "No," I said firmly. "He promised. He'll come home." I couldn't give up. Not after all this time. Not after all the prayers, all the letters, all the nights I spent looking at the stars. Marco was my son. My heart told me he was still out there, somewhere. So I kept waiting. I kept hoping. I kept setting a place for him at the table. Because as long as I did, there was a chance he would come home. Chapter 5. A stranger arrives. It was an ordinary day, just like any other. I was in the garden, picking vegetables, when I saw a figure walking up the dirt path to the farm. At first, I thought it was one of the neighbours coming to visit. But as the figure got closer, I noticed the uniform, a soldier's uniform. My hands froze, and the basket I was holding fell to the ground. My heart began to race. The man walking toward me had scars on his face, and he looked tired, so tired. But there was something familiar about him. The way he walked, the way he held his shoulders. It reminded me of someone I knew so well. And then he looked up. Our eyes met. "Marco," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Mama," he said, his voice rough but filled with emotion. I ran to him, my legs carrying me faster than they had in years. Tears streamed down my face as I threw my arms around him. He hugged me tightly, and for the first time in so long, I felt whole again. My son was here. He was real. He was home. I pulled back to look at him, my hands cupping his face. The scars told a story of pain and struggle, but his eyes were the same. They were the eyes of my little boy, the boy who had promised to come back to me. "You're here," I said, my voice breaking. "You're really here." Marco nodded, tears in his eyes too. "I'm here, Mama. I kept my promise." I led him to the house, my heart so full I thought it might burst. I sat him down at the table, in the chair I had kept empty for so many years. I brought him food, water, anything he needed. But all I really wanted was to look at him, to make sure he was real. to make sure he was safe. As we sat together, Marco began to tell me about his journey. The war, the battles, the long road home. He spoke of the friends he had lost, the hardships he had faced. But he also spoke of me. I thought of you every day, Mama, he said. Your love kept me going. It brought me home. Chapter 6, Marco's Return. After all those years of waiting, of praying, of hoping, my son was finally sitting at the table with me. But I could see the weight he carried. The war had changed him. His body was tired, and his eyes held memories I could only imagine. As we sat together, Marco began to talk. He told me about the war, the battles, the noise, the fear. He spoke of the friends he had lost, the nights he spent under the stars, wondering if he would ever see home again. His voice was steady, but I could hear the pain behind his words. There were times when I didn't think I could go on, he said, looking down at his hands. But then I would think of you, Mama. I would remember your face, your voice, your love. It gave me strength. It kept me fighting. Tears filled my eyes as I listened. My heart ached for all he had been through, but it also swelled with pride. My son was so brave, so strong. He had survived the unimaginable, and he had come back to me. I stood up and went to the kitchen. I'm going to cook your favourite meal, I said, trying to hold back my tears. You must be hungry. Marco smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen in so long. That sounds wonderful, Mama. I cooked with all the love I had in my heart. I made his favourite dish, the one he always asked for as a boy. The smell filled the house, and for the first time in years, it felt like a home again. When the food was ready, we sat down together at the table. Marco ate slowly, savouring every bite. This is the best meal I've ever had, he said, his voice soft. We talked late into the night. Marco told me more about his journey home, about the people who had helped him along the way. He laughed at some of the memories, and I laughed with him. But there were moments when he grew quiet, when the memories of the war seemed to pull him away. I reached across the table and took his hand. You're safe now, Marco, I said. You're home. He nodded, but I could see the shadows in his eyes. The war had left its mark on him, just as it had left its mark on me. But we were together now, and that was all that mattered. Chapter 7, A New Beginning. The days that followed Marco's return home. They were not easy, but they were filled with hope, a hope I had almost forgotten. Marco was home, and though the war had left its scars, both on his body and in his heart, we began to heal together. Marco started helping me on the farm again, just like he used to. At first, he was quiet, his movements slow and careful, as if he were still carrying the weight of the war. But as the days passed, I began to see glimpses of the boy he once was. He smiled more, he laughed more, And when he worked in the garden or fed the animals, I could see the tension in his shoulders slowly ease. One evening, as we sat outside watching the sunset, Marco turned to me. "Mama," he said, "I want to make this farm better. I want to grow more crops, maybe even get some new animals. What do you think?" My heart swelled with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said. "This farm has always been our home, and now it can be our future." We began to make plans. Marco had learned so much during his time away. About building, about planting, about surviving. He brought new ideas to the farm, and together we worked to make them happen. We planted new crops, repaired the old fences, and even built a small shed for the tools. But it wasn't just the farm that grew. Marco began to open up more about his experiences. He told me stories of the friends he had made during the war, of the kindness he had seen even in the darkest times. And though the memories were painful, sharing them seemed to help him heal. I listened to every word, holding his hand when the pain became too much. "You're safe now," I would remind him. "You're home." And he was. Every morning, I woke up grateful to see his face. Every night, I thanked the stars for bringing him back to me. Marco was my son, my heart, and having him home was a gift I would never take for granted. One day, as we stood together in the garden, Marco turned to me and said, "Mama, I don't know what I would have done without you. Your love kept me going. It brought me home." I hugged him tightly, tears in my eyes. "And you, my son, have given me a reason to keep hoping. You are my strength, just as much as I am yours." The story doesn't end here, my dear. It's just a new beginning. Marco and I will face the future together, with hope in our hearts and love to guide us. The war may have taken so much, but it could not take this. Our bond, our home, our promise to each other. And so we move forward, one day at a time, grateful for the better days ahead.